Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to be focusing on Bitwig's Saturator, and we're going to break it up into three parts. The first part will be the technical analysis, where we'll also compare the Saturator to our other two analog distortion models that come built into Bitwig. The second part, we'll try to do a couple of examples, a few different places where you might use the Saturator and compare it to maybe a couple different plugins that I have. And then the third part is just the wrap up, and we'll talk about, how valuable this tool is for you, how much you might use it, where you're commonly going to use it. And we are going to focus more on the traditional applications of the Saturator. So we all know by now that Bitwig really encourages a lot of modulation and experimentation, but that's not really something we're going to be doing in this video. So let's go ahead and get started. We'll bring our test tone in, and then we're also going to turn our amp on. And one thing that you'll find is that with these three different distortions, they kind of do the same thing. They're just packaged to you differently, and they have different features depending on the package that they're in. So for example, with the amp here, we are not using the EQ, we're not using the cabinet, we are just using the amplifier section. We have the stereo mode turned on, and in this configuration, it's very similar to what the Saturator is going to do in terms of how those harmonics are generated. When we come in on the smooth model, all we see are odd ordered harmonics, and we can drive in harder. We can see more of those start to appear. And then when we want to bring in even ordered harmonics, we do that by messing with the bias control. So as I turn that up, we'll start to see 800 pop in, and we'll see some of this area getting filled in like so. Okay, you'll also see that we get this little hump at the bottom here. So whenever you are working with saturation and distortion, overdriving, be aware that that can occur, and you probably do want to filter that out, which you will do at some stage in the production. Okay, so it's not something you have to worry about immensely, but it is something to be aware of that can take up a lot of space and take up a lot of headroom if you're not careful. Now, when we really drive this in hard and we maybe even increase the bias a little bit more, what we'll be able to do here is use the Sag Control, which is supposed to model the way a tube handles large transients. And we're going to see it kind of cave some of these guys out here, and we can get something a little bit smoother that's going on. And of course, there's like a lot of variations, a lot of variety you can get. And don't be so tied to this image of thinking that any signal that you put in is going to, produce something like this. This is a perfect case scenario where we're just using more or less a sine wave. In real life, you have signals that are varying in amplitude and also are always kind of sweeping across the frequency spectrum. And so the way that this reacts is going to be dependent on the source that you feed into it. But this is just here as a nice little visual aid. Additionally, we have a couple other models that are clearly analog inspired. We have two more transistor models. We have class A, and let's go ahead and just bring that in and just turn the bias off for now so we can see what this one emphasizes. And you can see that this one actually does emphasize that first harmonic, or like I guess it's considered maybe the second order. I'm not sure, but you can see that we're getting that first 800, and then we're getting some of our odd ordered harmonics. And this is what you'd a lot of times associate with like a bass driver. So if you have a sub bass and it's not really hitting through into the audible range, or for people on smaller systems, this is a common type of distortion that you use. It kind of emulates that missing fundamental principle without being so gritty and so grimy that it loses some of its original character. And so again, we'll drive this one a little bit harder. Let's watch and see what happens when we use the bias here. Okay, we can see that like so. We can see how it's kind of changing things. And then again, when we use the sag characteristic, once we start to breach into the yellow a little bit, you can see how much it just kind of tapers off all the rest of those. And then really it's just focusing on the first few. And this is something that you'll see a lot of times with, I'm trying to think of the good example of this, like with an EQ maybe. Okay, so not a whole lot going on, but a little bit of a saturation characteristic. And then we also have the class AB, which is interesting because for us to get any signal at all, we actually have to turn up the bias, and then we can see that we're getting a little bit of that fundamental, and additionally, we can drive in further. All right. And again, this one can be very, very subtle. Don't freak out when you're seeing this thing clipping here on the output. It's really not actually clipping in terms of what we're seeing pop up here. We're not seeing the digital errors. That would only be occurring at the final output stage, so don't let that freak you out. Anyway, here in the amp is one type of a saturation characteristic, and we have three that are clearly analog inspired. And when we think about an analog system, what that really means, and the way I always describe it is, let's imagine that we had a tape machine and we're recording onto tape. That tape is only so wide, the actual physical tape itself, and only so much dynamic range can be captured. It can only capture so much in perfect fidelity, but at the sacrifice sometimes of loudness, right? So if you drive into that tape and it goes beyond the range that it can handle, that's where you're starting to get an analog saturation. And so like instead of it capturing this peak information clearly, it kind of lops it off, but that information can't just be destroyed. So it gets redistributed at harmonic intervals of the source that's coming in. Okay, and the same thing is true with tubes, with transistors. You know, it just depends on how that balance is altered in how it redistributes the material, which is different to digital types of distortion like the bit 8, and we talked about this a lot in that video, where, you know, you're getting 1s and 0 errors, and so actually trying to predict where that's going to occur is a little bit tougher. It's not going to follow the harmonic series necessarily. Okay, so that's the amp, and this is supposed to be like a guitar amp. So if you have like guitar rig, you can do all those sorts of things and also mess with the cabinet, which further shapes and changes the sound, and you have EQs as well. But the way we were looking at it was just to the amp itself. Now, let's move on to the distortion. And I associate the distortion a little bit more with like a stomp box type pedal, so like an aggressive guitar sort of distortion. But when you bring it in its default state, it is actually pretty subtle. And you can see that we're currently just seeing a couple of those odd ordered harmonics pop up. So this isn't a bad setting to bring something in on if you want to saturate it ever so slightly. Let's remove that gain, makeup gain at the beginning. And let's start to drive in a little bit harder. And we'll see more of those odd ordered harmonics start to come into view for us. Okay, like so, and we can see the balance. Now with this device here, the way that we bring in the even ordered harmonics is we mess around with the symmetry control. I typically don't touch the DC bias on this one. You can, but when we start to mess with the symmetry, you can now see we are getting some of those even ordered harmonics, and then you can further kind of tailor the sound by messing around with the slew control. Okay, so when I start to pull that back, we'll see some things change. Typically, I do leave it right around that 80 mark, which I think is its default state. And so we're not getting anything too wild or too crazy. But again, this is all following harmonic intervals, okay? And so the distortion is just, again, a very sort of classic saturator type effect if you want to use it to do that. So there we go. That's our second example. Now, third example is when we come into the saturator itself. And the thing that's so different about the saturator, and let's make sure we turn that low pass filter off, is that when we come in for the first time, we are actually seeing something that we typically associate with dynamics processors. We are seeing a threshold control and a knee control. Okay, and so what this is telling me is compared to these other two, the amp and distortion, where I would need to use some kind of a makeup gain, excuse me, to control the final output. So we always were seeing when we were adding harmonics, there was no compensation for that. This was just going up and up and up and up. Here with a threshold control, it doesn't work that way. Okay, it's adding in those harmonics when we breach a certain threshold. So right now, when we look at this shape, this is just a linear shape here. And if I adjust this drive control, all we're doing is turning up and down the volume until we reach threshold or until one of these other controls is touched and adjusted so that we see, you know, this line going over. So if I turn the volume down, we can just see that it's going down, and you can see the way that that shape changes. When we turn the volume up, and I'm just going to unlink this stuff for now, when we turn this volume up, I need to get it to cross that 0 threshold before we start to see harmonics popping in. So I think I just have to get a little bit over 6, and we should start to see that. So there we go at 6.2. We can now see our overtones coming in. And again, we are just starting with odd ordered harmonics, but notice how we get to 0 and it's just holding there. It's not shooting past that at this point. And we could obviously bring this down further if we wanted to, okay? So once we get past that smooth, just clean line, that's when we start to add in those overtones. And now here we can shape these overtones in a variety of ways using the controls over here. So this skew control is now what's going to bring in our even order harmonics and change this balance. And we can see that like so. Okay, and you can see the way that this graph kind of changes accordingly, where we're associating the orange with like the quiet part of the signal and the yellow with the loud part of the signal. But all you really need to know is that with this skew control, we are adding in even order harmonics and changing that balance accordingly. We also have, and let's go ahead, let's bring our drive back down. And what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to set the threshold right to 6 so that right as we drive in a little bit, we're going to expect to see some harmonics. If I even just go below 6, we're also going to see that here, okay? But let's put it right at 6 for now, or something close to that if we can. Whatever. That's good enough for me. I'll bring the drive down just a little bit so we're not getting anything yet. We also have a knee control, okay? Just like a knee control on a compressor, okay? This is gonna smooth this out a little bit, and we'll then see the way that these overtones are brought in is now not nearly as aggressive as it was when we came across on that hard curve. And just like we saw before, we can use our skew control to emphasize other even harmonics and just kind of change this balance. You can see the way that we can just kind of try to play around until we get something that looks nice or something that's not overly aggressive. Things like this are very nice sounding saturation curves, nothing wild, nothing crazy. The other thing we have that is a little bit unique, something that I'm not used to seeing, it may exist somewhere else, is the ratio. And with the ratio, we're now actually going to see this curve kind of change. And again, it's just going to change the way that those harmonics are spit out and generated. So let's go ahead and raise this up first. Let's create something like this. And now let's start to drive into it and let's watch and see what happens. Okay, again, not nearly as aggressive as it was when we didn't have that set up until we get to, of course, a little bit of a higher point, and then they're going to start to spike up just a little bit more. And again, you always have to be imagining what's happening when you have a much more complex signal that's going into this. It's going to drastically impact the sound and what's being driven in. If we add in a little bit of a knee characteristic here too, we can take this even further to something like that, which is cool and again, very subtle, something that you'd classically expect to see. And when we go in and we look at things like the Decapitator or SDRR, when we go to the different modes, it's basically just pre-settings of these things working together. That's basically what that is. So it's found some very flattering sounds. It's probably analyzed some analog gear and said, okay, well, how much does it preface this harmonic? How much does it preface this one? Like, do we want to add in some of the even stuff a little bit there? Okay, and that's the way that that works. So we're really just making those presets. And when you work with the Saturator, I would strongly encourage you to use the presets that are there or create your own formulas. Like make your formula A, B, C, D, E, so you can quickly scan through without actually going in here and setting it like this, because this is kind of ridiculous. You're not actually going to do this or want to do this in real time. You're going to want to have some curves that you've already saved. So that's the way the loud section's working. The really unique thing here with this loud ratio is that you can actually have it point and go down the other way. And this is not like anything I've ever seen before with the Saturator. And it's a really cool effect. And you can get sort of these curves and things that you would never expect that you could get otherwise. So I really have had some fun just kind of looking at the unique shapes that I could make here. All right, now that we've spent a good amount of time looking at the loud section, let's transition over to the quiet section, which is something very unique to the Bitwig Saturator. So it's going to allow you to shape the saturation for the quiet parts of the signal independent of the loud parts. So normally that curve works together. So if we watch it when I drive in, and we'll turn on the compensation just so you can see that going down, you can see that those two shapes work together in perfect harmony. And this is normally the way that a saturator would work. So when I add the knee, we can see how those are reacting together. When I change the control here, the skew control, you can see how it's creating that one kind of curve. Well, now we can actually impact the quiet differently, and we could shape that curve differently. And that's what we're going to look at here in just a second. I just want to bring everything back to how it originally was, and we're going to now work with that quiet portion. Okay, and the quiet will only work, and why am I still getting saturation here? I must be driving in way too hard. Let's bring that back. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead and let's get some of the quiet just working. And it's really interesting. It won't work until you adjust the ratio control. So let's go ahead and just tilt this ratio control a little bit. And what we see is we start to get these really high harmonics generating and nothing down closer to the fundamental. And the idea there is it's always assuming that, you're not just going to have a sine wave like this, but that you are going to be hitting both the loud and the quiet. But let's say you just wanted some really, really high-end sizzle that is harmonically related, something that you would normally do with a digital distortion because you're not as concerned with the overtones up here in terms of it impacting your harmony and all that balance. But now you could do it. You could do it using the quiet section. And again, we have control over things like knee and over threshold. And remember that with a more complex signal, how you set this thing is going to be a little bit more sensitive every single time. So you kind of have to do it program dependent. We can start to add in that knee control here, and we can get a few more things popping up. Okay, or again, if we want to see more happening here, we would adjust this threshold and raise it up. And then eventually there's going to be a point where, it almost starts to balance out completely. All right, but I think it's actually really fun when you go the other direction and you're just barely hitting some of those higher ones. Like this, I think is a really cool concept and idea there. The skew controls will not work as it relates to the quiet portion. This one will work, but that's because it's actually still impacting the loud. So if I bring this down, eventually we'll see that the loud starts to get triggered. So this isn't really related to what's going on in the quiet section. You will see the shape kind of change a little bit, but it is responding to the loud portion of the signal, just as an FYI there. But what's fun is when you're able to combine these two and use them together to get some really flattering type saturation curves, which we'll get to in a second. So the final thing we should look at are just our controls that we have over here. So if we were to bring this down, let's just add in a little bit of a knee here. Let's bring our threshold down a little bit just to generate a few more harmonics. Let's drive ourselves in here and add in some of the even ones. Let's go ahead and just create something like that. Okay, we can actually close up the curve setting and we can look at what these things do. So the first thing we have is a normalize, and you can associate normalize almost with like an equal gain match. So the big difference between what we've been looking at over here and what we're looking at with the saturator is this is more of a dynamic effect. So what it will do is it will take into account all of these harmonics that have been generated and then try to adjust the gain accordingly. So right now our peak value is at minus 5.9 because we're probably not driving it that hard. If I turn this on, we can now see that it's set that peak value to be 8.8, but in theory, it should be an equal loudness to what we had brought in initially. So as I drive this harder and harder, we'll see the peak value going further and further down. Okay, as it tries to adjust for all of that extra information that's coming in. You can also offset this at any point if you need to, so don't feel like you're stuck, but you do have that option. Let's bring that back in and do that like so. The other thing we have is a low pass filter, which is only going to respond to the saturated signal. So your actual signal is going to be clean. So this is always kind of doing a little bit of a like parallel compression type effect, if you will, where you can always kind of mix back in. And the low pass filter is going to adjust only the saturated signal that's present. So if we go in here, we'll see that we have two different options as well. There's a G and an R. And this is something that you'll have to listen to because on the display, it doesn't really do it justice. So the G is a gentle slope. And when you use that, especially if you're using it on a really complex material, it does sound really smooth and really nice, and it kind of tames some of those higher harmonics that we have seen become present here. You can actually see the shape of that filter. When we go to the R, what you'll see is it's going to do a similar thing, and it's going to kind of round these off. But when you're actually listening in more of a complex signal, it's like kind of bumpy, and you'll hear parts still sticking out and still being kind of grainy. But that's something that you have to listen to. We can't just analyze. But yeah, that is the Saturator in a nutshell. So we'll take a short break. For you guys, it will be just a couple seconds. I'm going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back with some practical examples on how to use this beast in context. Alrighty, so we're going to go through a few examples here where we're going to use a peak limiter, the saturator, and the decapitator, and then we'll compare and contrast the end results. The first one I'll do in real time, and then all the other ones I'm just going to go ahead and pause the video and do the settings so we can just very quickly do the compare and contrast. And the reason for that is it's just taking me too long. I've tried to record this a few times, and I just sit here and I fiddle for too long. So let's go ahead and get started. The reason why I'd use the peak limiter is because this is one approach that you sometimes want to try before jumping in and using the saturator. So if you have a track with lots and lots of instrumentation, if you have like 100 tracks, the peak limiter makes a little bit more sense because it's not going to crowd the frequency spectrum. Whereas the saturator, we're audibly adding things. We're trying to add overtones and harmonics. Same is true with the decapitator. The peak limiter is trying to be transparent. So with a lot of EDM genres where there's not so many instruments, there's not so many tracks, a saturator is a good idea. When you're doing something more in a pop style or something where you have just tons and tons of tracks, it's never a bad idea to go and try the peak limiter first and see how you like the sound of that. So without further ado, let's get started. This is going to be the first thing we'll be listening to. Okay, so just a little an acoustic recording here. And we can start to use the peak limiter. It is peaking out at -1 dB, just as a reference. So one little thing is peeking out there that we might want to fix. That one's jumping out. Sometimes the computer can really be annoying. Okay, so that will sound a little bit better. And sometimes you got to do that if you have a situation and you're using a peak limiter and something just pokes through too much. It just barely doesn't get caught by the limiter and it's supposed to be quieter. You might need to go in and manually pull some stuff down. So just making sure this sounds good. Yep. Okay, so there we go with the peak limiter. Next, let's use the saturator. Just a little bit on that side. have to do our little gain compensation here. See where we're peaking out at. Okay, so we can bring in a decent amount of gain. That's actually pretty aggressive, but it still sounds pretty smooth and nice. I do like the way that this sounds. Okay, and now let's try the Decapitator, which usually goes a lot faster. I'm not gonna play around too much with these settings, just for the sake of speed here. Turn auto off. Back it off a little. And yeah, we can bring the gain up. Okay. We can listen to our 3 different examples. So this is with the Decapitator. This is with the Saturator. And then this is with the peak limiter. And I think if I had to pick one in this case, I think I would go with the Saturator. It's probably still a little bit too aggressive, so I would back down on that drive a little bit, try to get the low end a little bit cleaner, or potentially with the Decapitator, if I went in here and probably messed around with some of these settings, I would prefer one of these two on that particular source material. So I'll pause the video, we'll come back, and we're going to listen to our next example, which is more of an EDM loop. Okay, so here's our sound. It's peaking out at -1. This is without any processing. Or actually -1.6. I did add an EQ in the break just to try to make sure we don't get any subsonics. Okay, so here's the peak limiter. Saturator. And then the Decapitator. And so for me, with a signal like this, my personal preference to my ear, what sounds best is the peak limiter. I like the way that that actually brings and keeps things flowing. The Saturator kind of just milks it too much in both of those cases. Okay, so let's move on to the next example, which is just going to be kind of a stock standard drum loop. All right, so here we go with our drum beat. Again, this should be peaking out around -1, or a little higher than that, actually. And we'll listen to it with our 3 different processors. And this would be our first example where I think all three sound really good. So it's just whatever your personal taste and preference is. And you can always fine tune the saturator and also fine tune the decapitator to kind of get some different timbres. But I like the way it came out on all three of those. So I think any of those would work just fine. Up next, we have more of a sub 808 bass. So if you aren't listening in headphones, you might want to do that, or be sure you're listening on speakers that can reproduce the lower end. Okay, so our next example is with this 808 here. And admittedly, this time we've gone pretty aggressive with it. So let's go ahead and start with our peak limiter. We're kind of making it do some erroring. Okay, and then our saturator. And then the decapitator. So for me, again, I think either the saturator or the decapitator could work just fine. It depends on the tone you're going for. And again, there's a lot of fiddling you can do to try to fine tune that. And last but not least, this one's going to be more of just like the sonic effect. We're going to listen to a pad sound. Okay, and then last but not least, we have our orchestral pad sound. So let's take a listen to this one. And believe it or not, even though this sound seems like it might be screaming for a little more like saturation and grit, I think I prefer the peak limiter on that one, in all honesty. But again, that's just my personal opinion. You might completely differ. It's always one of those things that it's up to interpretation when you're working with these different sounds. So that is the saturator in practice, and we'll be back in a second to just kind of wrap things up. We've reached the end of the video, and it's time for some final thoughts. The first thought is I think that the saturator is a really powerful and cool device. It's very Bitwig in the way that it's designed, that you can make it do natural things and unnatural things with, not overly complex controls. Some of them you don't necessarily understand the meaning, but you understand what it's doing to the sound, and I think that that's all that really matters. With that being said, I don't think I'm really going to use the saturator that much. And the main reason is I'm already pretty set in my ways with what I do use. And while I definitely encourage people to try to use the built-in stuff that comes with their DAW when and where it makes sense, there's also a point where if you're used to doing something else, it's hard to maybe break that. And one of my complaints, and it's not really a complaint, it's just something that maybe I'd like to see, is in the presets for the saturator right now, I really like this particular folder. I like the way these things are named. The problem is some of these shapes are just like way more digital and unnatural to others. And there's nothing wrong with that, but what I'd really like is just to have maybe like 10 to 15 presets that are all just subtle, slight variations, of like analog model 1 to analog model 10, where you can quickly flick through those and just hear the differences and figure out something as a starting point that you want to work with quickly and easily. Here, with some of these, if I flick through them, some of them are just so wild that they're definitely not going to work in more of a classic context. And that's the reason why, for me, and what I do most of the time, I actually don't use Decapitator that often. I use it on drums, like on kick drum sounds, but in terms of like pad sounds or groups. I very rarely to never use it. I usually use Satin. And what I do with Satin is I come in, I go into the presets, I come over into studio mode, and I just immediately start flicking through these kind of classic models. And almost every time, within about a minute or two, I find something that tonally speaking, saturation-wise speaking, I really, really like the sound of. And if I don't like what's happening with Satin, I might bring in Real Bus, or I might bring in Lux, which is more of an exciter, but it does, more or less the exact same thing. And for me, that's the reason why I don't see myself coming to the Saturator, because I get the sense and feeling like I'm going to have to do a lot of fiddling. You don't have to do a lot of fiddling. You can just bring it in and play with the drive control, but then you don't have any easy control to the shapes from within this view. And that's not a deal breaker by any stretch of the imagination. It's a very, very good sounding Saturator, and it does what you expect it to do. It gives you a lot of control over your signal. But for workflow and ease of use, for me, I think that I'm not going to bring it in and use it very often. Nothing against it. That's just my personal opinion and what I can see myself potentially doing. Reminders that, again, like with everything in Bitwig, you can drop these things into containers. You can take all of these ideas so much further than I've shown you here, but hopefully you have a better idea of what a Saturator does, how the Bitwig one works, how the Bitwig one sounds, and some of my final thoughts there. So thanks for watching, and we'll be back with another video soon. Take care.